bring this expertise all the way around to talk about our marketplace. My name is Brian Tormey. I'm very happy to be here. And we've got a fabulous panel that Richard is going to introduce here in a second. But I just want to thank everyone for being here to I think it's like the 19th or 20th installment of our Be Your Best webinar series. So with that, Richard,
count those up. I don't think we've counted them.
We haven't counted them. I know it's like right around there. So for the next one, we'll come in with a tally. But I'm going to hand it over to you, sir.
Thanks, Brian. And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Be Your Best, our webinar series to share best practices for getting real estate deals done in New York. I'm Richard Haggerty, CEO of the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors. We're a not-for-profit trade association representing more than 13,000 real estate professionals in Manhattan, the Bronx, Westchester, Putnam, Rockland, and Orange counties. I'm also President and Chief Strategic Growth Officer for One Key MLS, the comprehensive multiple listing service for the New York region. One Key has more than 45,000 subscribers and serves the region from Montauk to Manhattan to Monticello. And quite frankly, I think a lot of us are thinking about the East End or going to the Catskills, one of your favorite haunts, Brian, as the long weekend approaches. But before we head out for the holiday, we're focused on getting the deal done. Today, we take a look at leveraging purchase CEMAs in a tightening market. Our panel of experts are going to help us understand the nuances and the benefits of this important transactional structure. As always, we're pleased to partner with TitleVest and have President Brian Tormey moderate our discussion. And today, Brian, given your expertise also in CEMAs, I think that you'll be playing part of the panelists as well. So we're looking forward to your insights as well today. TitleVest is a leading New York City-based title insurance company, agency, and member of the First American family of companies, offering a full range of services for real estate property purchase and refinance transactions. TitleVest has offices in Manhattan and Westchester and engages in transactions upstate, downstate, and nationwide. TitleVest has won the New York Law Journal's Best Title Agency Award every year since 2013. Now let's meet our panel of experts. We're pleased to have with us Scott Vandermark. Scott is the Senior Managing Director of First Republic Bank in New York City. Also joining us is Robert Frankel, a real estate attorney and partner in the law firm of Cohen & Frankel, LLP of New York City. Scott and Robert, thank you so much for being here. Brian, handing it back to you.
Thank you.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Richard, as well as to your whole team at One Key and HGAR, Jeff, Kathleen, and all the teams. These have been a great series. We really appreciate them. Thank you for always hosting them and helping pull them all together. A few quick housekeeping items before we dive in. Questions are extraordinarily welcome, especially on sort of like a little bit of a complicated esoteric topic like purchase CEMAs. We ask and encourage everyone to use the Q&A function here in Zoom. So you can find that for most people at the bottom of your screen. It's a little sort of two chat bubbles over each other next to the participants list called Q&A. Some people on their app, it will be up in the top part of your screen. So please use that, submit your questions. We'll tee them up and put them to the panelists here for some good answers. And before we get 100% launched, Richard, as Scott and Rob, and we were sort of just talking about as we warmed up the session, the market is going, there's a lot of market fluctuations. One of the best things that we do on these webinars every month is we get an update, all the magical numbers that you and the One Key team are able to pull together through all your data. Tell us what we're seeing in the market from a data perspective.
Yeah, we were chatting before we began the program that we're seeing a softening. And I don't think anybody thought that we would at some point start to see the softening. And certainly we've got the perfect storm of rising interest rates, low inventory, which we've had for gosh knows, it seems like years and years, but it seems like it keeps on getting worse. And obviously inflation right now, inflationary pressures. So we are certainly seeing that have an effect on the marketplace in the last, just looking right now at single family homes, and this is all of the One Key geography. For the last 12 months, we're looking at a reduction in inventory, a reduction in new listings of over 15%. Closed sales are only down slightly though. Closed sales are only down about 3.2%. So that's, it's a gradual slowdown that we're seeing. Median sale price though continues to go up over the last 12 months. It's an increase of almost 15%. We are seeing, though, pretty strong numbers for condos and co-ops. And I think a big part of that is the affordability factor. We can still see a lot of values in condos and co-ops, so those sales are still trending pretty strong. But one source that we all seem to go to every Monday is Donna Olshan's market report, which is New York City sales in the 4 million and above range. Mm-hmm. And it was a very interesting report that came out this past Monday, where there was a reduction from the previous week of over 20, I'm sorry, let me see if I had 16 fewer contracts, which was a pretty big reduction. Now, we obviously can't, look at a 1 week snapshot and say, well, this is really an indication. It's got to be a longer trend pattern. But I think that we are seeing a softening of the market. So I think that, quite frankly, the timing of this topic today is perfect.
Yeah, I would very much agree. Okay, well, so as Richard said, for all our attendees, today I'm going to play my role sort of as normal moderator, but also purchase CEMAs have been for me one of those sort of geeky topics that I have loved delving into. I've written white papers and memos on and articles on. It's been something I've loved for over 15 years, sort of knowing all the mechanics. It falls very well inside my title geek purview. So I'll also be a little bit of a commentator. And we're going to kick off with a little bit of Mechanics 101 for everyone in attendance here and who might be watching this video later, and start with a discussion of what is mortgage tax, right? So mortgage recording tax is a tax that we've got here in the state of New York that applies to properties throughout the state, and there are different rates in different locales, both at the county level and in some cases based on more specific geography. And it is a tax, it is a percentage of the mortgage debt that is being recorded at the public county level that is due as a tax at the time of recordation. So that means when you're closing on either a purchase with a mortgage or a refinance of your existing mortgage, that tax gets collected by the title company typically and calculated off the new recordable debt amount. Okay, now we also have here in New York, so we've got a mortgage tax in the state of New York, and it's fairly high, especially as we look at some markets like New York City. It's a pretty high mortgage tax. It varies by property type, loan amount. There's a whole bunch of variety, but simply put, it's a fairly high tax at that transactional closing. We also have here in New York a few provisions within our laws that allow for the reuse of mortgage tax that you've already paid. So as a simple example, you've come to Scott, you've taken out a mortgage on a home that you bought with Scott and the First Republic team, and it was a $2 million mortgage. And now you're going to go refinance that $2 million mortgage, and you're going to pay it down a little bit, and you're going to refinance it for $1.8 million. Well, instead of needing to pay mortgage tax, you already paid mortgage tax on the $2 million mortgage. And instead of needing to pay mortgage tax now again at the time of refinance on the $1.8 million new money or new mortgage amount that you're going to do, we have a provision here in New York that allows you to claim credit. Section 255 allows you to claim credit for the tax you paid at the time on the $2 million mortgage and use that tax. We're going to use a round number here and say that it was $40,000, right? So instead of that $40,000, we're going to claim that credit that you already paid and use it on that $1.8 million mortgage, so that now, because we went from 2 million down to 1.8, you have no mortgage recording tax due at the time that you're refinancing that $2 million mortgage into a 1.8 here with Scott and the First Republic team. So that's mortgage recording tax. Typically, we talk about it all the time as part of the closing costs on either a purchase when you're taking out a mortgage or when you're doing a refinance. And in a typical refinance transaction that's more than a few $100,000, they'll do what's called a CEMA loan, which is CEMA stands for Consolidation, Extension, Modification Agreement. So in a CEMA transaction, you take that old mortgage, you assign it to the new lender, it stays with the same lender if you're refinancing the same lender, and you might modify the terms. Maybe the rate changes, you extend the payment terms and the amortization schedule out to the new 30-year schedule, typically. And there's a document called a CEMA that sort of documents all that. And with it goes a 255 affidavit that the borrower or the parties involved are attesting, hey, mortgage tax was paid back here of this amount on this same debt with the same borrower. We're moving and claiming that credit for our mortgage tax again on this new refinance transaction and this CEMA. And therewith, you don't end up owing the amount you subtract from your new amount due, the amount of mortgage tax that was previously paid. Now, it might be that in one of these transactions, you had a $2 million and now you're going up to $2.5 million. Well, now you would owe mortgage tax if you do one of these CEMA transactions on the what's referred to as the gap mortgage, the difference between that $2 million original debt and the $500,000 of new money that you're doing. So you would owe mortgage tax on the $500,000 in this case. Now, so that's a typical CEMA transaction. Real estate agents, you're probably not involved in those many on your clients' refinances, so that's not necessarily your normal purview. But Scott and Rob here see that routinely with their clients on their refinance transactions. But today we're here to talk about the application of that same strategy to a purchase transaction, where we are taking a seller's mortgage and we are assigning it from the seller's lender, and there with the seller, to the buyer's lender, and there with the buyer, and taking advantage of the mortgage recording tax paid when the seller took out their mortgage and moving that credit over into the buyer's column, essentially, when they're going to record their new mortgage as part of their purchase. There are a lot of special circumstances and considerations that come into play here. And that's part of what Rob and Scott are going to give their expert guidance on. But really simply, if we sort of think about it in the general high level, a purchase CEMA is taking the seller's mortgage and really specifically taking the mortgage recording tax that they paid when they recorded that mortgage and leveraging it and claiming it as a credit against the mortgage recording tax due in conjunction with the buyer's new mortgage. And there's some mechanics of how we move and assign that loan from the seller's lender to the buyer's lender. We'll get into some of those mechanics here today. But today, we're here to talk about those mortgage tax savings, and there's potential, if the transaction is structured just right, to actually have the savings apply to also the transfer taxes due on the transaction. There's some unique special circumstances there. So we'll get into that in more detail. But I just want to start with a little bit of a mechanics for everyone in our audience, a mechanics 101 of what a CEMA is, how that works here in New York, and what we're doing. So now we're going to dive into our panelists. Scott, you're a powerhouse in the mortgage industry. You're doing 1 million of them a day. You and your team are just rock and roll in the market. You tell us a little bit about these savings as you see these transactions happen. Who are you typically seeing these savings go to? How much these savings add up to? What are some of your thoughts and commentary on sort of where these dollars and savings go?
Sure. So as you pointed out, on refinances, it's standard operating procedure, very ubiquitous in the marketplace. Everyone does them for the most part to the extent that the documentation allows for it. As is the case in refinances, similarly in purchases, it's not a guarantee. The chain of title has to be intact, and there has to be, an appropriate level of documentation to support the CEMA. So it's not something that just happens, automatically. There are conditions that have to be satisfied, in order to achieve a CEMA and the savings associated with it. In the purchase market, you see it. People are starting to get more acclimated, to the savings opportunity. And so we're seeing them more frequently now than ever before in the resale market. Obviously, there has to be a note outstanding on the seller's real estate so that the assignment can be effected. And the size of the seller's mortgage has to be, adequate in order to justify the expenses to complete the CEMA. You'll talk about, that conceptual break even later. And the seller has to agree to do it. As a buyer and borrower, I can't, simply execute a CEMA without the cooperation of a seller. So the seller has to agree. There has to be a note, of adequate size. The seller has to agree to go through the exercise and participate in the assignment. And then there's oftentimes a negotiation as to how the savings is apportioned. In a perfect world, affect the CEMA and I get 100% of the savings. So I pay no mortgage recording tax. But oftentimes if the seller, once the seller becomes aware, that the savings is available and that they have some leverage because the CEMA can't be accomplished without the participation of the seller, there's some negotiation as to how the savings, gets allocated. And it just becomes a negotiated item. We've seen all different kinds of percentages, allocated between buyer and seller. It also applies to the new development space. And a lot of sponsors, if the project is eligible, and you can speak to, the eligibility requirements later. But assuming, a project is eligible, there's mortgage tax savings to be accomplished, in the purchase of a new development unit. For the most part, sponsors are very savvy and typically take 100% of the savings for their own benefit, and many times will actually write into the offering plan that not only are you required, to go through the process of assignment, but then all of the savings, the mortgage tax savings, will accrue, to the benefit of the sponsor. So it exists in resale. It exists in new development. In resale, it tends to be a negotiated item. In new development, depending on whether it's a seller's or buyer's market, for the most part, sponsors typically will take the benefit for themselves, unless, of course, they're having trouble moving units, in which case it becomes something that they can actually dangle, as a carrot for the benefit of the buyer.
Yeah. Rob, we're going to come to you in a second to talk about negotiating it and spelling it out in the contract, but I want to give one quick example, a real life example of one of the aspects that Scott referenced, which is, we've got section 255, which allows a seller to go to a buyer with carrying this debt over. And section 339 EE, which is this section that condominium developers, sponsors, and other parties as well can take advantage of, that allow the use of the condo project, the new developments, mortgage recording tax to get assigned over, what Scott was referring to here. And as Scott said, most developers typically are structuring their offering plan and their contract around, and Rob, I'm sure you've got some stories around this, they're going to recapture 100% of those mortgage tax savings. They're going to require you to do it, and they're going to, sort of recapture that. But Scott and Rob, you can speak to this. That might become a negotiable thing. I have seen the case, and this is something for our agent audience, especially, to be mindful of as they're doing their transactions. I have seen developers' standard contract include a provision that said, even if we can't give you the mortgage tax credit under 339E, which there are some requirements. We're not going to get into all the nuance here today, but has some requirements around the timeline from when they first put their shovel in the ground to when they completed the closing of their first unit. That timeline, if they fail to meet that timeline test, they aren't able to avail themselves of section 339EE's mortgage tax savings. And yet I have seen sponsor contracts that say, even if we, the sponsor, can't deliver you a mortgage transfer tax affidavit that delivers this savings to you, or even if you don't take a mortgage, you still owe us this amount of savings as the proportionate amount of what our recoupment would have been from you. And I've had one transaction where the attorney, definitely not Rob is eagle eyes, but the attorney on the transaction did not catch this. He knew his client wasn't taking a mortgage and was all cash. And his client ended up paying the mortgage, the equivalent of mortgage recording tax on the transaction, even though he wasn't taking a mortgage. Separately, I had a different client have a transaction where the sponsor, this is the real sticky one, the sponsor didn't end up being eligible for it. So the client, the buyer, did take a mortgage in the second example, paid their mortgage recording tax, and paid the sponsor a credit on it. They paid their own mortgage recording tax functionally twice. That attorney ended up chipping in on one of those. Obviously, in both cases, it got sort of missed in the contract negotiation because it's complicated language. You need an attorney who really understands and is able to look at these details. Now with that, Rob, I'm going to turn to, I think, one of New York City's best attorneys who knows this stuff forwards and backwards. Tell us a little bit about, as you see, whether you want to talk about the condo development sponsor side or on the purchase CEMA side, what are some of the things you think about when you're getting into the contract negotiation side of things?
So CEMAs have been around for a long, long time, everybody. And we have used it more or less, not as a negotiable item, but more the lawyers used it once a deal was brought to us and it was agreed upon. And then, we negotiated who's going to get what. And, typically it's some percentage, 50-50, 60-40. But I see now today, brokers who are trying to make a deal and they're close, but the buyer's not going up and the seller's not going down, and mortgage recording tax savings can bridge the gap. So if, well, let's just say generally I don't see many people get involved in it unless there's at least about $1 million mortgage to transfer over.
Mhm.
So that means the seller would have to have $1 million worth of mortgage, of outstanding principal on their mortgage. And, in New York City, the mortgage tax rate is about 2%. It's a little bit different than that, but let's just call it 2% for simplistic sakes for our discussion. 2% of $1 million is a $20,000 savings. But if it's a large deal, a $5 or $8 million deal, or a $10 million deal, and there's a $5 million mortgage, now you're talking about $100,000 worth of savings. So if a broker is savvy and there's a little gap between the two, they say to the seller, it's not going to cost you anything if the buyer takes all of it. What if we keep your price? The buyer's $100,000 less. It's, but you agree to assign your mortgage in full to the buyer and let the buyer take the benefit. So the buyer gets that benefit, you get your price, and off we go. And sellers do that. I have found that sellers do that. So when a deal is really tight to make, and you can give the buyer's not coming up, the seller wants some number, but you can give the buyer the benefit of the full mortgage tax, sellers don't mind, they're getting their number. So that's one aspect for the brokerage community to be aware of. And if you have your favorite lawyer, you can speak to your favorite lawyer during your offer and acceptance and negotiation time period of how to utilize that so you're accurate in your, even if you know nothing about mortgage tax, you can talk to your lawyer and come up with accurate numbers. If the parties easily reached their number and made a nice deal, and mortgage tax wasn't brought up, and me as the buyer's attorney want to save my client some money by getting a seller's mortgage assigned, and again, if it's sizable, I absolutely try to do it, then it's more of a 50-50 relationship because it wasn't a negotiable term and both parties are taking advantage of it and both parties are benefiting. There's depends on the size of the mortgage and the complexity of the deal. If it's a very simple condo, basically there's about $2,000, $2,500 per side, maybe $4,000 or $5,000 in total in fees. If it's a complicated townhouse or a commercial transaction, it's more than that to assign a mortgage. In the new construction space, as you both have just brought up, it got trickier as the market the last 2 years, where a developer gets a construction mortgage to build a building. And let's say he gets $100 million to build a 150-unit building. As Brian said, there's 2 statutes that deal with mortgage recording tax assignment. The easiest one was, as Brian discussed, I think it's about a 2-year period where when you put your shovel in the ground, you have to have a closing. And there's some other requirements, but that's called the 339 affidavit or E affidavit. And most of the time in the past, the developers were able to meet that requirement. But over the past 5 years, I guess maybe DOB slowed them down or other factors, but they have missed that two-year statute frequently.
Mhm.
And so they started putting another line in these contracts and offering plans. And they say, we will strip off a piece of our construction loan that's allocated to your unit, and we'll assign that piece of mortgage to you and your lender, and you'll do a CEMA on that piece of mortgage. And that's like a typical assignment of mortgage that we do in the market as a normal buyer and seller, not even new construction. So now new construction can take a piece of their mortgage that's allocated to their unit, strip it off of their construction loan, and assign it to the new buyer's lender. And then you do a CEMA, you modify it and do the paperwork. And it is true that in these contracts, a lot of these developers shove in there that if we can't take one assignment of mortgage, we're going to take the other one. And regardless of your lender, if they take it or not, you the buyer, are going to pay us their mortgage recording tax credit.
Yeah.
So every one of my comments back in offering play, I'd say half or 3/4 of them now have backed off that and said, you'll ask your lender in good faith to get the assignment of mortgage done for us, and the sponsor takes it all. New construction sponsors always take all the mortgage tax. I've never been successful at negotiating that back for the buyer. However, I certainly don't want to pay it twice or have my client pay it twice. So I see the market adjusting to that new concept, and sponsors are putting in a little bit more reasonable language that if your lender will accept it, then we'll take the mortgage tax. But I still do put in the language that if my lender doesn't take the assignment of mortgage, buyer is not responsible for paying mortgage recording tax. So as a brokerage community, I think as the market is tightening, in the other outside communities, Brian, just for general purposes, so the brokers can walk out of here and have an idea of money, because it does come down to money, and I want them to make a deal more than understand just the vehicle of an assignment of mortgage. 2% in Manhattan and New York City, and about 1% in the borough, in the outside counties, Westchester, Nassau, upstate. Some are 0.75, but out east, the Hamptons, I would just estimate for rough purposes, 1% outside of New York City, in all the boroughs, and 2% inside New York City. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that's a good generalized rule of thumb. There's, here in New York State with our 62 counties, I think we have something like 30 plus different rates based on which county you're in, which town, all the things. I think there are 30 different variations, but I think you just summed a chart that we have that's like full page down into a really good, pretty accurate rule of thumb. For this purpose, that's all you need is a rule of thumb. So you're like, oh, what savings are at play here, right?
So you can crunch the numbers. So if you have $1 million loan at 1%, it's a $10,000 number. If you're in the city, that's a $20,000 number. And let's say you have, $4,000 or $3,000 of costs to come out. There's one other piece that I do want to mention, and that's transfer tax, the New York State transfer tax piece. You can normally take this it's a seller transfer tax. So I think the transfer tax for the seller is 0.4%, up to 3 million, and 0.65% over 3 million. And that's another deduction. Once you assign the mortgage, you can take a credit as against that payment of that transfer tax, and the seller is not required to pay it. We in the community, in the legal community, when we negotiate these contracts, we put that savings as well into the pot, and it follows the negotiation of the mortgage recording tax savings. And so if we're saving 10 grand on the mortgage tax and we're saving 2 grand or 1,500 on transfer tax, that would go in the pot, and the parties, whatever percentages we divvied up for savings, that's how it would flow. So that's basically how I see and use the savings in my practice, and how I see brokers use it.
Yeah. So I think I wanted to, so Rob, great, excellent commentary overview of some of the contract machinations. We're going to come back to some of those and dig a little bit more into some of the nuances. But before we do that, Scott, I want to turn to you and ask some questions around some of the special considerations, right? You made brief mention of this, that not all banks do them. Can you expand a little bit about that and sort of talk about, in the banking world, you know, whether or not a bank can choose to do an assignment, whether they can choose to receive and accept an assignment? Give us some of the flavors there, because that ends up becoming an important thing to know when you're walking into this conversation.
So I think there's a wide degree of variability as it relates to execution on CEMA. You know, we hear horror stories. I'm sure, you know, a lot of folks on this call have been exposed to, you know, CEMAs that mysteriously take 6 months. It's been 6 months, and you know they're still waiting, you know, for completion of the assignment. During COVID, that was, you know, particularly true, you know, because everything was backed up, and CEMAs, you know, were just deprioritized, and they were just, I mean, we've heard stories of CEMAs taking a year, which is a horror show, you know, in the context, particularly for purchase. If you have to, you know, if you're engaged, you know, in a purchase transaction with a contract date, obviously you're foregoing the CEMA at a certain point and just closing. On refinances, you tend to just extend rate lock until you ultimately achieve the CEMA, because the mortgage tax savings is so large. So, you know, we see now that COVID is somewhat behind us and, you know, conditions have normalized, the degree of variance has tightened a little bit, but there is still, you know, some banks can do them in a month, some banks can do them, you know, in 2 months, and some banks still take 4 or 5 months, you know, to complete them. So, you know, diligence on the front to determine, and sometimes, you know, banks don't know, you know, how long it's going to take them. So I'm not suggesting that, you know, it's an exact science and you'll always be able to get a forecast, an accurate forecast of how long it's going to take. But, you know, it's important to do one's best to dimensionalize the timing, you know, on CEMAs, you know, if the bank has agreed, has the capability and has agreed to do it. And there will be a fair amount of variability on how much time it takes and the quality and efficiency of execution. For the most part, all banks do CEMAs. There's one notable exception. HSBC, as a corporate policy, doesn't do them. You know, customers get extraordinarily, it seems, you know, very anti-commercial and anti-competitive, and it infuriates clients. I don't know, it's a terrible policy because, you know, any client who finds out about it as they go to refinance their mortgage, you know, will swear never to do business with the bank ever again. So I think it hurts them more than it helps them. It helps them. I suppose the theory is that, you know, you direct the refinance. You capture more refinance volume, because if you're not allowing third-party CEMAs, then someone's more likely to keep it with HSBC as a consequence of only being able to capture that savings at HSBC. But for the most part, that is the only bank that I'm aware of that does not do CEMAs. Everybody does it, just with varying you know, degrees of timing and reliability.
Yeah, I'll add one in that we come across. It's not the most common bank here in New York, but People's Bank is a bank that it's not, they will do CEMAs on the receiving side, but they won't assign out.
Interesting.
So, and they make you sign a special disclosure when you're doing your initial mortgage, acknowledging that you recognize that later, if you ask for a CEMA with another bank, they won't assign out to another bank. So that's one of the other ones we've come across in the years. But Scott, thank you. That was a lot of good detail. And again, this purchase CEMA construct is one for everyone here in the audience. It can have a lot of powerful, Rob, to use your phrase, sort of gap bridging ability to help make a deal happen, right? And help bridge that gap between what the buyer's willing to pay and the seller's willing to take. And or if even if they've already had a happy meeting and they're both set and happy on the price, to Rob's point, it can be a windfall to both parties. But there are these special considerations that we really need to think about and, you know, sort of assess. So Rob, you made a comment about there sort of being some additional fees and that kind of stuff that sort of net out against the savings. Do you end up addressing those as, you know, as you're thinking about, because those fees can be in the, you know, it's not that much, but it's in the, it's 1,000, could be a couple thousand, you know, 1,500, 2,000, depends on the complexities you said. It's a couple $1,000s. Do you address that sort of in your approach to the deal terms, like, hey, we're going to make these savings? How do you talk about who's going to make the cost, who's going to pay the costs?
So we generally, however we split the mortgage recording tax savings with the transfer tax, as I described, we net it. So we say we say it's going to be a 50-50 split after fees. So we put, so it's fair to everybody. The lawyers, you know, there can be a lawyer that only charges, you know, $500 or $1,000 on one side. I have seen $2,500 and $3,500 fees as well on one side. I have seen, so there's a wide variation. If it's a small residential deal, the lawyers and the banks also, when you ask for a payoff letter, they will charge more for the assignment because they have to get the original note and mortgage back from their departments and ship them to somebody. So they charge for that. So the fees are all over the map. But we negotiate that into the, we just net it out. It's a very, we just strip out the fees. So if it's a $10,000 savings and a $3,000 fee, then it's $7,000 savings and each party gets $3,500.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's not complicated. That's not complicated.
And I want to touch on one other aspect.
I just want to say one more thing.
Oh, yeah.
If I'm representing a client that wants to close in 30 or 45 days, whether they be a seller or a buyer, the mortgage assignment process goes against that grain. The bank attorneys out there that have to do this work, that's who does the work. I'm doing contact work and moving people to talk to people, but I'm not doing legal work and looking at paperwork generally in this process. And the bank attorneys who are doing CEMAs just don't put that at the top of their lists, and they don't act quickly, and the banks don't send documents quickly, and so the process is not quick. You can't have you know, I wouldn't dream of having a 30-day or 45-day closing with a CEMA, and 60-day truthfully is aggressive. If we had a 90-day closing, I would be more comfortable. So that goes into my thinking for advice to clients in the transaction.
Yeah, I think
I'll piggyback on that for just a moment, because I think
Please.
it's an important point. I think, you know, to the earlier discussion, you know, about the variability in timing and execution, which is, you know, what Rob's talking about. And so it's ill matched with a deal that needs, to perform at a high level. The other problem that, you know, the group will encounter is it's not just, an elongated process. It's also what we all find is that there's nobody to talk to, that it's this black hole, and you try and get updates on, where the process stands, and there's no good, reliable feedback that comes back. So it makes it very hard, to manage expectations and to manage the timetables. And so, to Rob's point, emphasis on, something, needs to close efficiently and quickly. It's not going to pair up, very well with the opportunity to create some tax savings through CEMA.
Yeah. So we've got some things that need to be taken into account, including, there are things, Scott, as you've touched on, where it may be that you touched on this earlier. It may be the case that you said it, you've got enough time. Your attorney, like Rob's, works out who's going to split out the savings. You get it all in motion. You've got time and you let it proceed. But then there are things, Scott, as you mentioned, that might mean that it doesn't actually end up succeeding. So this is one of those other expectations you have to set up front. Once you've paid that fee to the payoff firm, they've pulled the file, they sent it to the new bank attorney. That new bank attorney, representing the buyer's lender, reviews the seller's loan docs. There's a chance, and Scott, do you want to speak a little bit to like what can happen in that review moment?
Yeah, so there can be a lot of documentational challenges, to the ability to successfully complete a CEMA, chain of title, being, probably, at the top of the list.
Yeah.
And you don't really know, what those documentational challenges, will be until you get into the transaction and you start to organize all of those documents. I mean, you've got project, eligibility or ineligibility, as you and Rob have mentioned. But just in the ordinary course, the documentation has to be, near perfect. And some banks will accept, affidavits to substitute for missing documents. So there is a way to cover over documentation imperfection. Not all banks will do that. And sometimes the documentation imperfection is so glaring that the bank is just not willing to take the risk, because the risk is that you close the CEMA, and the buyer and seller, depending on how it gets apportioned, get the savings benefit, but then the bank actually ends up paying the mortgage tax because the CEMA ultimately gets rejected. So there is a risk tolerance that comes into play, when all the documentation gets organized, reviewed, in order to complete the CEMA, and the documentation might not meet the test. That's probably the most commonplace manufacturing defect when it comes to CEMA.
Yeah, agreed. Well, this, great answers. I want to pause for our audience. We've just talked about a whole bunch of the expectations you need to set, the challenges that you can face, so the pitfalls that come. But to take us back to the top of the meeting and the conversation, before I turn to you, Rob and Scott, with some prognostication, you're going to pull out your crystal balls and tell us some things that you see in the future. But I want to just anchor everyone back in that, this can be a pretty powerful tool. And I think Scott and Rob would probably say the majority of them, where the parties are coming together and you got smart parties, most of them succeed, right? Scott and Rob, would you agree that, most of the time, if you go at it, it works.
Yes.
It just takes some more effort, some more dollars, some more nuance and attention paid, some more patience, but it can be a meaningful amount of dollars. As Rob said, to sort of simple rule of thumb here, in New York, you're talking about mortgage tax rates around 2%. And then you've also got this transfer tax savings if the deal is structured the right way and the right litmus test measures are met for the continuing lien deduction, that can add up to another whole slug. So essentially what's at stake here can be a few percentage points of the deal. How often have deals broken over less than 1%? Or worst case, for our agent audience here, the parties are like, hey, we can't bridge this gap. but you've got some commissions sitting there. We want you to bridge the gap out of your commissions. Well, all the better. And why we're here today with the HGAR team to tell you, here's another tool in your tool belt when someone's asking you about that. It's a different tool to pull out. Okay, with that, I want to turn to you both, Scott and Rob, and ask, we got a really dynamic moving market right now. As Richard gave us some stats, things are changing, what's happening. How do you think, as you look forward here into the coming months and year or two, what do we think purchase CEMA is going to play in this market? Is it going to have more importance? Is it going to fall by the wayside? I know in the hot and heady days of not that long ago, when contracts, there were bidding wars, people were going in all cash, inspections waived. If you proposed a purchase CEMA that was going to extend your close timeline, you get looked at a little askance. What do we think, Scott? I'm going to turn to you first. What do we think as we look forward here?
So, I mean, what we're seeing, regularly is searching for every opportunity to create some savings in order to substitute for a higher borrowing cost. Everyone's doing the math, fairly, well acclimated to borrowing with something, that has a 2 handle on it. And so, when all of a sudden it has a 3 or a 4 handle on it, they do the math, and the spread can be pretty extraordinary, particularly on the large balance loans that get done, even affordable, the affordable luxury segment in Manhattan results in, $1, $2, $3 million loan amounts, which at a 200 basis point increase in rate results in hundreds of thousands of dollars, over some, call it a 10-year estimated life of ownership and of the loan. So every little bit counts. And, what we're seeing is, an exhaustive search for credits wherever they can be found. And the purchase CEMA fits perfectly into that. I mean, it's a relatively, low stress way to create additional savings, when all other options have been exhausted to do so.
Yeah, wonderful. Rob, how about you? What are you seeing? You've always had a great perspective on what's coming around the corner. What do you see around the corner?
I think the city pricing. So the pandemic brought out a bifurcated pricing model for New York City and the burbs. And the burbs really appreciated a lot more than New York City over the last few years. And so the city has been pretty stable in its pricing, maybe gone up just a tad. It started at the low end that was on fire, then the medium end, and now the high end has followed. And the high end, even though Donna's report showed a little bit of a decrease, I still see, deals being made. New construction, luxury new construction is not completely back to pre-pandemic levels, but it's moving slowly in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
I think the people in the city have mostly relocated. There's still sales going on where they're in Florida and they want to go to the burbs. So demand in the burbs is still significant. But I don't think the burbs and the Hamptons is another, animal where the prices are just, super high because demand has been so high for the last 2 years. I think the city is going to keep traction and continue on. I don't think, and eventually I do think that pricing will start to rise. I don't think the burbs are going to rise as much anymore. I think pricing will stay stable, and I think a lot depends this year on the economy. If the last 5-6 years, we saw for the first time that Wall Street and real estate were not connected. But prior to that, if Wall Street did well, real estate did well. And it changed recently. And I think that it may follow again. So If Wall Street continues to tank and we're down 20% this year, if we go down another 20%, then I do think everything will slow down a bit.
Yeah. And do you think as that slows down, do you think, how do you think getting the deals done, right? So that's about, volume. Do you think getting the deals done gets tougher?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. And CEMAs come into play, as I told you. I have brought it into my practice. I'm a high-end practice. So I'm dealing with usually millions of dollars in a deal. And there's money if the seller does have a mortgage to be saved on a CEMA. So CEMAs are a part of the business. It would be the banks are the problem in CEMA industry, and the consumers haven't pressured the banks. The business model of the CEMA should be an easier process to happen, and it's not.
It's not, we're not there yet.
Still, I have to watch that. One of the two lawyers has to watch the emails carefully and manage it. If one of the two lawyers does not do that, that CEMA goes nowhere, because the two bank attorneys who are put in touch by the lawyers, they just can't finish it. They just don't ever finish it. So it would be nice if someone came along and showed everybody that this process could be a little bit more seamless, and we click a button and do it, which may happen. That may come along. Maybe a bank will advertise it, or maybe a company will come along. Maybe title be a
Title, I
common.
still have to put on my thinking cap.
But I think that someone has to make it a little simpler for this to blossom into a mainstream real estate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, it's interesting, Rob. I agree. I think, I did a transaction in somewhere around 2000, is before the 2009 thing. So probably, let's say 2005 or 6, and personal transaction. I introduced a purchase CEMA into the conversation with the agent at the time, right at the beginning of the process, not late stage. And the agent, a very well-known name in New York City, at one of the top, probably, I don't know exactly, top 2 or 3 brokerage brands in New York City. Big team. She had a team back even then, before teams were so much of a thing. And she thought I was suggesting, tax evasion, and it was what I was suggesting was immoral and unethical and illegal, because she was like, I do this many transactions a week. I've never heard of it. Now this is like, let's say it's 2006 or something when I bought that place. She was like, I've never heard of this. This can't be a thing that's legal. Otherwise I would have heard about it. And now fast forward. I mean, I remember going out and doing presentations on this topic in the early aughts and in the early 10s. And it was like, people were like, what are you talking about? Right, Scott? You're sort of nodding and smiling. Like it was an unheard of thing. And now everybody understands it. Everybody knows it. It's recognizable. But you're right, Rob. It's still, the clunkiness of it still means that it doesn't, you gotta have some stomach, a little bit of push. And I think that's worth setting the expectations here. There's real money to be saved, a few percentage points of the deal possibly to be saved, right? And it's, by the way, those savings are, because of how it all works, they're closing cost savings, right? They're not just savings that like, oh, I'll save that money over the life of my loan. No,
Right.
it's closing cost savings.
Cash dollars at the table.
Cash dollars at the table, after tax cash dollars at the table.
Yes.
Part of why I was smiling, and it was mostly related to Rob's observation about how poor the execution is on the part of banks around CEMAs. To illustrate that point, even more profoundly, I lend commercially as well as residentially. And as Rob, can attest, on a commercial transaction, CEMA is, far more SOP, and we get them done, in 48 to 56 hours. I mean, so, if a CEMA, just to put it in perspective, a CEMA is, an organization of documents and execution of documentation that if everyone is focused and fully dedicated to the task can be accomplished in a day. There's nothing about it that takes 2 months or 3 months or 4 months other than the lack of attention on the by the participants to the assignment.
Yeah,
I have one
that's very
for
well
you.
said.
Uh,
Yeah, Rob.
I do commercial real estate as well, and the CEMAs are a whole different. It's exactly how they should be in the residential land, and we do it as a matter of course. And give me what a commercial bank attorney on one of the two sides. They're getting real money for that assignment. They're charging $3,500, $4,500 one side. It may cost 5 or 10 grand in fees, but you're saving, a $5 million mortgage or a $10 million mortgage recording tax number. It's a big number or bigger on commercial land. So the bank attorneys are making money and their eyes are open. In the smaller residential land, the bank attorneys need to be pushed, and the volume for them to make it worthwhile. So I think it's up to the banks as to make this an easier process.
Yeah. Now I will say, I'll go back to the one thing, the difference in the commercial and residential world is in the residential world, there are those transfer tax savings. But so there's actually more tax savings potential in the residential world that doesn't apply in the commercial world. Interestingly enough, there's like more fruit on the vine over here in the residential space as a percentage, right? The percentage of closing costs. But with that, I want to pause here. We're pretty much at time. Scott and Rob, I can't tell you thank you enough for being here. A lot of expert guidance. We're going to put up your contact information here on the screen, and people attending today. And we know we're headed into what looks to be a glorious holiday weekend. So the attendance today hasn't been as big as our events usually are, but thankfully Gary and the HGAR team will put this up on the website, and we know that a lot more people are going to benefit from your wisdom, your expectation setting, your guidance. So Scott and Rob, thank you so much for giving us some of your time in what we know to be busy times. Thanks so much. Richard, thank you for being here and hosting. Always a pleasure, and look forward to the next in the Be Your Best series.
Brian, thank you as always.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.